Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. A global welcome. On behalf of Sanames 4, I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of our High School Counseling Excellence Knowledge Platform. We're excited to have you with us for our first webinar series on counselor well-being and embracing the new normal. Today, we're joined by experts from NIMHANS and Lehigh University for a session on child and adolescent mental health. The session aims to provide important information in regards to supporting the mental health of students and the well-being of our counselors. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel to you. Dr. Preeti Jacob, Associate Professor at the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NIMHANS. Dr. Nitya Purnima, a clinical psychologist by training and works with children at NIMHANS. Dr. Christopher Liang currently serves on the editorial board of the Counseling Psychologists and the Psychology of Men at Lehigh University. The session will be moderated by Mr. Sameer Arora, a collaborator and educator with over 24 years of school experience, not limited to teaching, but also has experience of establishing 2 travel-based startup apps offering experiential learning programs to the youth. He's the vice principal at the Legacy School. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Mr. Sameer Arora.
Thank you, Ritika. I think as you mentioned the word new normal, I tried to Google it. And guess what? It had 2.38 billion times search in less than 40 seconds. So one can imagine our obsession as a mankind with the word in state of normalcy. And more so now when it's almost 227 days, we've not been able to live the life we used to. I was reading a report of a study conducted in England and Northern Ireland, which stated that in this lockdown era, about 20% are experiencing a generalized anxiety disorder. It's about 33% are reporting symptoms of major depressive disorder. And additionally, 20% are indicating post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm not sure if the statistics in India are going to be very different. There are 2 conflicting views. One of the opinion is that as a nation, we are more resilient when it comes to mental health. Due to our conditioning probably, or due to our family support system as compared to the West. On the contrast, some of my colleagues feel that mental health is still a taboo in India, or even if you're experiencing symptoms of depression, PTSD, anxiety, we won't talk about it or reach out to any kind of professional help. So this is just to set up a context. We as counselors, I'm also a counselor other than being a principal, vice principal. So we are unable to meet our children face to face in these times. We are unable to see the humans they are, alive, in action, conversing, sharing, talking, laughing. What we see now is a meme on their Zoom screen and we talk to them. How do you even see bright eyes or otherwise when you talk about their aspirations and ambitions and challenges? How do they share their vulnerabilities with the counselor they've never met and have only seen on the screen? We continue to struggle with these challenges. And of course, necessity is the mother of invention. We've devised different mechanisms to draw the most about them through their narratives, essays, colleagues, but there is as much you can know about a child without being in touch with him. Children are also exploring new dimensions of their lives. One of the dimension, a couple of colleagues I was talking about, it was very surprising because when this conversation started, I reached out to a couple of my colleagues and started talking about children's challenges. They mentioned that children are experiencing a new dimension of their life, the marital issues in their parents' marriage, and that's causing a lot of stress in children at a young age, especially in the time when they're transitioning into university life. So that's causing emotional trauma. The technology addiction has made them physically, emotionally, and socially more aloof. Their health issues are on all-time high, while their mental health has gone for a toss. So I think we're going to talk about that with Dr. Preeti, who's going to take us through a presentation and talk about student well-being. So over to you, Dr. Preeti.
Thank you. So the new normal, I think, is it's one of those words that we're going to probably have the Oxford give us a new set of meanings for in 2021. But yeah, so when I was thinking about what I'm going to speak about today, I thought I would focus on the word well-being instead. And when we speak about well-being and not happiness, so when we say student well-being, what do we mean by well-being? And well-being as such is a term that is just so much more wholesome construct than happiness is. happiness at the end of the day is a transient feeling as opposed to well-being, which is a more resilient feeling of overall mental and physical health, strength, resilience, and fitness to function both at work, home, personally, professionally, and in all spheres. So when we look at what do we want for our students, or what do we want for ourselves even, it is not a transient quality like happiness, it's a more resilient quality like well-being. And how does one look at well-being in a situation where just the pillars of well-being, which would be our relationships, the engagements that we share in our work and in our relationships, the meaning and purpose that we draw from in our everyday life, a sense of accomplishments that we have in our everyday life, simply don't exist in the same form as it did, 6 8 months ago. And so, how do we redraw these parameters? How do we relook at positive emotion? How do we relook at engagement, relationships, meaning and purpose and accomplishments, which are the pillars of well-being as given by Seligman, is something that came to my mind. And the other thing that I wanted to speak about today was, it's obviously self-evident why student well-being is important. Learning won't happen in an environment where the child or the adolescent feels threatened. Learning won't happen if the child or adolescent is in a troubled state of mind. And so schools need to care about well-being, which is why counselors are such a big part of the well-being of students. Um, when we talk about counselor well-being, which is what today's topic is on, counselor well-being is also related to student well-being. And so that is why between Nitya and me, we thought I would speak about student well-being and she would speak about counselor well-being. So to that end, what are we looking at in children? In children and adolescents, we're looking at well-being as being an important life skill that a counselor, the school, the parents of the child, the peers, everybody else invests in order for us to look at well-being as an essential life skill that the student takes away from coming out of school, much like he or she would be competent at a certain level of physics and a certain level of chemistry and a certain level of English, much like how we would look at those skill sets as being important for a student. We're also looking at well-being as being an important competency skill set, if you will, that a student has to have. And that is where a counselor comes in order as being an important scope in that field, in teaching students that ability to maintain their own well-being. And so that is another point that I wanted to. Um, when we look at stress and well-being, obviously they share not a simple relationship, but it is, a relationship where some stress, it's your Dawson curve, as it were. So some stress is absolutely necessary and even positive, and it can even be life-affirming and changing and life-changing. But we are worried about prolonged stress, which essentially leads to cortisol buildup and a preoccupation with that condition, which results in various problems, including problems with sleep and concentration and appetite and weight changes and low mood and irritability and what have you. So therefore, it is not that we don't want students to experience any stress. That would be wrong. It is that there is an optimal amount of stress at which point the strength and resilience of the child kicks in, and it's where there are gaps and breaks in that we need to supplement that with the school's ability to accommodate certain difficulties, the counselor's ability to help the child in that situation, and of course the parents' ability to be supportive during that period. Another thing that I wanted to speak about was why adolescents, why are we, so worried about that particular period in time? We are because there is just change in every aspect, whether it is physical, whether it is mental, whether it's neurobiological, whether it's social, and now that we are in the age of the internet, those add enormous stresses to the child, to the adolescent's life, which again has a ripple effect on every aspect is broadly what I want to speak about. And where I thought that counselors can come in a big way is one is to actually have the adolescents open channels of communication with them in order for them to be able to support at that crucial point in time. To talk about the basics, which is good sleep, good nutrition, having a sort of handle on their on what they need to do, having a handle on their routine, on their curriculum, things like that. To look at relationships and to look at ways that relationships need to be built that are safe and fulfilling. To look at children who are learners and not performers. And so, what are learning attributes? What is the role of failure? And why failure is really a stepping stone to success. We don't want if we don't want children to grow up as performers. We want children to grow up into adults who can take um, a step back and who can then pick themselves up if there is a need for that. And of course, we need counselors to look at life skills, to look at mindfulness, to support parents in being able to support their children. And so, to me, the job that counselors in schools do is so vital and important. And I think that this topic today about talking about counselor well-being to me was just that important to be able to support the people who support tomorrow's adults. So thank you, and I will hand over to the minister.
Thank you, Dr. Preeti. You brought in a very interesting point that well-being is a life or a competence-based skill to build upon in the school through the intervention which can be formally done, and the foundation of which is laid on safe, fulfilling relationships. So thank you so much for that key takeaway. And I think one of the other stakeholder in the child's journey is us as a counselor. And we used to do a group sessions with children who are going to different countries, bring them together and kind of do common sessions. But right now, keeping children's mental health in time, we all counselors are meeting children individually, which means our work has multifold many times. And typically for us, it doesn't mean work from home. It's literally working at home. The lines between work and family are totally blurred. And our meeting goes sometimes beyond 9:30, 10 p.m. And there's no concept of holiday for us, or even for that matter, Saturdays and Sundays. And on an average, if I'm not exaggerating, if I have 100 students, I'm spending around 12 to 14 hours a day minimum to meet my compliance. And of course, the context has changed. So we are also talking about upskilling ourselves by attending webinars, workshops, courses to see how higher ed will view our children in a different context. So we're talking about strained relationships. We're talking about not being able to give time to our own children. We're talking about our guilt of not being able to give 100% to our families. So we are also stressing or leading towards a stress which is very unhealthy. It's not an optimal level of stress. So I think Dr. Nitya would like to talk about how counselors can look after their well-being. Dr. Nitya, so we're really looking up to you today. Over to you, Dr. Nitya.
Thank you. At the outset, I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Preeti, for inviting me with this opportunity, and Sanam S4 for this opportunity as well. I have a deep interest in the well-being of mental health professionals, and therefore this is a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to connect with a group of counselors who are working in schools. And Dr. Preeti has very nicely outlined what the need is for this group of counselors to help growing children and adolescents with. So what I'd like to present is, firstly, an analogy of how I see school counselors as. So I see school counselors, one, as a node. So you would see that nodes are these parts in the plant from which roots come out and from which shoots also grow further. So really they are the connecting point and where there's this huge potential for growth. And that's the way I see school counselors, because they have this great potential to really bring together different systems and communities within a school. I really don't see the role of school counselors as being limited to care only for children who have identified problems, which is one of their big roles. But other than that, to work on the school ethos, to support teachers for effective classroom management. There are so many roles that a school counselor often takes up and is endowed with. And therefore, how does one then nurture oneself as a node? I'd like participants to bear this question in mind so that they can see what comes up for them. The second analogy that I would like to present is looking at school counselors as a kaleidoscope, where school counselors really have the job of looking at the meaningful patterns that emerge within seemingly disconnected pieces. And with every twist, you find new perspectives emerging. Okay? And that is the sort of flexibility and wisdom, if I may say so, that a school counselor might require to be able to make sense of these evolving patterns within school systems. And therefore, then how would a school counselor need to take care of themselves if they have to enable themselves to be flexible and wise to see these evolving patterns? The third analogy I'd like to make is of school counselors as a holding pen, a safe space where there is enough opportunity to run around, grow, fall, get up, but something which is firm and protective. So really balancing the opportunities for freedom with firm limits. So then, if that is one of the roles, how does one take care of themselves? How does one take care of themselves to be able to allow their consumers, which may be the students, which may be the teachers, which may be the school system, to experience this balance between freedom and limits? And as I'm speaking, I do recognize that there is great diversity in the degree of empowerment that a school counselor has across different school settings. And it is keeping in mind this diversity that each person would need to decide what is possible for them to work with, what is beyond them, and what is something that they can hope to strive for. So when we look at each of these elements, whether the school counselor as a node or as a kaleidoscope or as a holding pen, one of the key things that we look at is how inherently the counselor is an agent of co-regulation. Now, by which I mean that whenever there is a situation of conflict or distress, the school counselor is in a role where, by their mere presence or through their actions and plans, they allow for the system to experience a different level of stress, a reduced level of stress, a reduced level of conflict. And if this has to happen, how do we take care of ourselves? Right? We are all, as human beings, very, very resonant beings. We pick up on the emotions of people around us. That's the natural way we function. When you're around an agitated person, we feel agitated. When you're around an anxious person, we feel anxious. When you're around a calm person, we feel calm. And very often with high school students, where their emotions are oscillating quite a bit, they are going through struggles themselves. When as counselors, we are expected to co-regulate their ongoing emotional turmoil, how do we take care of ourselves? Right? So these are some things that I would like to ask each participant to ask themselves, because what works for one person may not work for another person. And therefore, we need to really have an individualized idea of how to take care of ourselves. At the same time, it's possible to look at certain elements that we can shine our light on and say, How am I with this? So very quickly, I'll run through this. And this is based on some studies we have done a few years back on mental health professionals, where we looked at what could be the core elements of self-care. So to look at what is our relationship with ourselves. Are we nurturant, critical, neglectful, permissive? How do we treat ourselves? Do we listen to our inner voices? How do we respect boundaries for ourselves? Thirdly, to be able to assert ourselves, do we say no enough, right? People who are drawn to this field of caring are drawn because they want to help. And therefore, inherently, there is a dilemma to say no. But very often, that may be the tool that helps us take care of ourselves better. Do we protect time to nurture ourselves? Just as Mr. Samir was mentioning some time ago, when our entire day seems to be consumed by work, how do we rejuvenate? How do we rejuvenate to access those elements in us which serve as the node or a kaleidoscope or as a holding pen? Do we spend enough time and effort in honing our professional skills? Do we take adequate measures to take care of our personal conflicts? Do we use peer support and other support available to us? And are we able to keep away this role of being a counselor when that job is done? Are there times when we are able to say, I am just me, or I'm just a parent, or I'm just an art lover? I am not a counselor right now. Are we able to protect those times for ourselves? Okay? Now, very often, people might say, yes, I know what will help me. But these are things that go amiss because there are other priorities or priorities of others. So very often, we've found that what helps is to just stick up a little reminder. What can I do for myself in 10 minutes? When we need to take a day off, a few hours off, we often hesitate. But if we can take 10 minutes to take care of ourselves, what might we do? Maybe a foot soak, maybe a hot cup of tea, maybe listening to some music, maybe just sitting and observing nature. Yeah. So any of these things that can actually serve as a quick lifeline for us to refresh and rejuvenate. And when doing this regularly, one does find that their levels of responsivity are higher, our levels of reactivity come down, our ability to co-regulate seems much, much more stable. Yeah. And therefore, we need to look at what are things that we can do by ourselves and where can we take support. We don't have to do everything all by ourselves. It is a huge strength to feel part of a community, to be part of a group. That collective energy is something that is so powerful. And so what are these safe spaces that we have created for ourselves? Whether it's among peers, whether it's among our family, friends, within the school system, what are these safe, nurturing spaces that we can access? Yeah. So I'll stop here. I know I have presented my points more as questions than as suggestions, but that was intentional. Like I said, these are things that I would like for us to keep with us and see what emerges over time. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. I'm absolutely in awe of what you said, and I completely resonate with that. And I think last 1 week, my own exercise regime has gone for a toss. I haven't hit my strength and conditioning exercises. So, of course, the whole idea of being, co-regulator, if I cannot co-regulate my own professional journey, and I think I saw the smile constantly on Ritika's face, and we both were smiling through this conversation. It completely resonated with each one of us. So thank you. I mean, the analogies were absolutely beautiful, and I'm going to use them now in my conversations with my children, my parents, and constantly with my own self. I think so, most importantly. So thank you so much. And now we have Dr. Liang, who's going to bring the best of both the worlds together: the student well-being and the counselor well-being. And he's also going to give us a third perspective, as I call it, like a street lamp kind of a thing. And he's going to also talk to probably school leadership. Some of us are playing a role as advisors or leaders for trauma response approach, to look after the well-being of students, and also more importantly to look after the well-being of the colleagues and teachers and counselors. Over to you, Dr. Liang.
Thank you so much. I am so thankful to be a part of this panel. I want to thank you and Sanam for the invitation. I've really enjoyed listening to Dr. Preeti and Dr. Nitya. I so appreciate everything that they shared, and I feel like I've jumped in on a Zoom call with kindred spirits. And so thank you for that. It's a great way. I'm calling in from the States, and so it's a great way for me to wake up in the morning. So thank you to my fellow panelists for providing such great presentations, and I'm a little intimidated now to close this presentation up following the two of them. But what I want to talk a little bit about is just what we've been experiencing as a collective. We've been experiencing so many incredibly deep, stressful conditions these past 9, 10 months now. And in other talks that I've given, I've called this, a collective complex trauma, right? And it's because we're experiencing it together, certainly, and it's also complex in that there's so many different levels and layers of what it is that we're all experiencing. There's problems with unemployment and housing, food insecurity. There are problems certainly with health and disease, with the economy overall. And all of that has led to a high degree of uncertainty over the future. We don't know when we are going to be opening up our schools up again. So major disruptions in all different areas and facets of life. And this amount of stress and uncertainty and disconnection from one another, I forget who mentioned it earlier, but that connection that we have with one another is so important. And that disconnection, that stress, the uncertainty is already showing itself as predictors of poor mental health outcomes for adults and for children, exacerbating already existing conditions. And so we're in this moment and we're in this space. And although it may be really difficult to recognize, collective growth is possible, right? So we're experiencing this collective complex trauma. And we also need to recognize that collective growth is possible. And we also need to recognize that we don't need to just settle into a new normal. We can create the new normal, right? We are active agents in creating it. And that's why I just so appreciated the other panelists and their focus on wellness, on relationships, on self-care. I think those are really central components to what it is that this new normal needs to look like moving forward. It should have been exactly what the world looked like beforehand, but it is what we need to move forward to now. And as I think about this work, I think about some of the existing theory. So for those of some of you are a little bit more theoretically oriented, there exists theory to ground us. There exists research to ground us in this new way that we're going to forge these schools, that we're going to create the school culture. There exists theory and research that'll help us to co-create this new normal. And certainly, I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about also is centered on this desire to promote wellness. The first construct that comes to my mind is stress and trauma. And Dr. Preeti, Dr. Jacob, you talked about that earlier, and I'm so appreciative of how you did it. It's the stress is important to consider. There are certainly optimal levels of stress, as Dr. Jacob talked about earlier, and I attribute my success to that optimal level of stress, right? I experienced it just at the right amount and I became a doctor. I became a professor and a chairperson of education and human services at Lehigh University. And that's because of the stress and how I managed it, right? So a good number of us have experienced high levels of stress, and a good number of us have been able to demonstrate incredible resilience. And that's because at the individual level, we have maybe some personal characteristics, some disposition toward it, but also because of the environments that we have been nurtured in, our family environments that have taught us how to be calm, that have shown us how the importance of maintaining calm, but also the school environments, right? Not just the family environments, but the school environments that have also been nurturing and caring, that have extended their care of us beyond the academic to our social, our relational, and our mental health well-being, right? So people experience stress. That's no doubt. Individuals who don't have the individual capacity, who don't have the right environment, who haven't learned through experience, who haven't been able to practice new skills, they're going to be more likely to have problems with sleep, mood regulation issues, anxiety, and other mental health problems, as Dr. Jacobs spoke about earlier. Trauma is an area of focus of mine as well, right? So there's stress and then there's trauma, and trauma is related. It's a related cousin, is the way I think of it. And trauma is an experience that is life threatening, that causes us to have significant fear, helplessness, and I think about the definition of trauma, and I think about the people in the community, in my community, and I think there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of helplessness, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. There are people who have not been able to sleep, and of course, the lack of sleep causes other problems with mood and with just regular functioning. So we're experiencing together high levels of stress and high levels of trauma, and there is, no matter what our individual capacity is for coping, there is a point where it's just too much, right? Where it no longer becomes optimal. And for young people, we know that they have the social stressors. I'm so glad I'm not young because I don't have to deal with social media and comparing my life to other people's lives and how they present themselves. I don't have to worry about image management anymore. I'm middle aged and I really don't care anymore, right? There are also identity related stressors for young people, dealing with, who they are in the world and what they're going to do in the future. That's incredibly stressful. Some of us remember it and others of us have kind of forgotten, but it's there for young people. And of course, there are academic stressors, which are incredibly heightened right now for young people because they've been programmed to be really amazing high achievers. But what does all that mean right now in the context of COVID? Like, what does high achieving mean in the context of COVID? What do standardized test scores mean right now? What does college and university entry mean at this point? If someone wanted to apply to Lehigh University, what does that mean? What do they need to do to get in now? It's a new, these are new variables that students are having to incorporate into their mindset as they prepare for stress, right? So that uncertainty is adding to a lot of, I think, stress. So we have just the normal everyday stressors, but young people certainly are experiencing COVID in their own way. In this country, in the United States, we have incredible issues with racial injustice that Asian people experience, that people who are Black experience, that people who are Latinx experience. The racial injustice piece is very stressful for young people. That's another major area of study of mine. But there's also a different type of stress that young people experience, and this is complex childhood trauma, right? Adverse childhood experiences is what some young people experience. I don't know what the rates are in India. In the United States, though, 60% of young people 18 and under have reported at least one major childhood trauma, right? And just to kind of frame that, there are three broad cases of adverse childhood experiences. There's abuse, right? Childhood abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, childhood sexual abuse. There's neglect, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and then there's household dysfunction, right? Marital problems, violence in the home, substance abuse in the home, violence in the home. mental health illness problems in the home. Those conditions, those exposure to those experiences as a child is associated with chronic health problems later on in life, and also problems for young people in schools, mental health problems, behavioral problems, and academic problems. Some of the studies that we've done out of my lab have borne that out. Now, those are all kind of like family stressors, but there are also community-based stressors like discrimination, bullying, neighborhood safety, community violence, growing up in foster care that individuals may experience. So there's additional levels of stressors that people may have. And again, as I said earlier, all of these stressors are associated with negative academic outcomes and mental health outcomes. Ultimately, children need to feel safe, secure, and attached, right? They need that environment. If they're not experiencing at home, they need to experience it in schools. And that's the big challenge that Samir talked about earlier. How do you do that now in the context of COVID? How do you develop relationships with young people behind a screen? And so that's a really critical component of all of this. But when we get back into the buildings, there's a framework that we can use, and that's the multi-tiered systems of support approach, right? It's response to intervention. It's a way of organizing support services in schools that helps you to identify who is in need, um, and how to deliver those services to them. But it also helps you identify the different ways that we can deliver interventions at different tiers. My colleagues will know about, primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions, or universal, indicated, and selective interventions. And these are all focused on prevention, right? Because we need to be able to focus on prevention. It's a lot less expensive to address a problem before it occurs than after it occurs, right? Once someone experiences depression, they're more likely to experience depression later on in life, right? They're at higher risk for that later on in life. So we want to be able to prevent that. I think a good way to understand this is to understand that stress and trauma is not just a social experience, it's a biological experience also. When we experience stress, we have higher rates of cortisol levels shooting through our bodies. If we experience that at a chronic level, like we are right now as a people, as a collective, um, and if we're not taking care of ourselves, sleeping and bracketing our time and managing ourselves, that those high levels of cortisol are going to impact our brain functioning. And for young people, that's more concerning because their brains are still developing. So we need to understand that developing a new system in schools, I think, has to center on understanding how the biological, the psychological, and the social components all interact. The MTSS, is a nice way of doing it. There are 3 tiers to it. I won't talk about it today too much in depth because I know I'm probably running out of time, but 3 tiers. Tier 1 for everyone types of interventions. Tier 2 is for, is the targeted group of people, and tier 3 is for an even more selective group of people who really need more intensive types of treatment. And there's a screening process that's involved that schools can implement that can help them. But I want to focus on that tier 1 level because that's where the prevention piece comes in. Training is necessary. Educators need to know about this stuff. In my own research with schools, we found that our training with teachers has improved their understanding of trauma and responsive schools, helped them understand how trauma is associated with behavior and academic outcomes and mental health outcomes. And in our follow-up work, we have found that schools that we've worked with the training have better attitudes than schools without that training. We've also seen that ongoing work, consultation teams, leadership teams within a school is really important and helpful in sustaining the effort in building out what it looks like to have a trauma responsive school. So the training is necessary. The well-being of educators is super critical. Dr. Nitya earlier talked about how self-care is so important. During times of natural disaster, which is kind of what we're going through right now, research has shown that educators experience higher levels of turnover and burnout, right? So there's what we're experiencing now. And then I'm thinking as an education leader, what's it going to look like 4 months out from now? How many teachers am I going to lose? And how can I prevent that from happening? I need to pay attention to their well-being and how stretched they are. how many different things they're being asked to do, and how I might be able, as an education leader, provide the supports that they need so that they can sustain themselves during this time. But even after this time, they're going to need, they always needed attention to their well-being. So leaders really should focus on not just talking about self-care, but modeling it, demonstrating it, and providing opportunities for it. In schools that we've worked with, education leaders who have done that have found that their staff have lower rates of chronic absenteeism, and which is really important for building safety and security for kids. And they've also found that those schools with, we've also found that those schools with more focus on teacher well-being have lower rates of behavioral problems in kids. There's an interaction. They're not siloed, right? We all interact with one another in a school system. So the relationships are super important within a school, very important. And the research shows this, it bears it out. Teacher-student relationships is critical. So we need to figure out ways to be able to do it. And Samir asked a great question earlier, how do we do that in this time? And we've got 69 people on this call. It would be really neat if some of you were to drop in the chat, were to include in the Q&A or the chat some of the strategies that you've used to build and maintain relationships with your students. It'd be really nice for us to be able to use our collective wisdom to build out what this experience is going to be. So I'll stop there. There are some takeaways. Stress and trauma are real. They're implicated in changes in the brain, resulting in poor mental health and poor academic outcomes. We need to understand that growth can occur, which is why I just so love what Dr. Preeti and Dr. Nitya were talking about. Growth can occur. That's what we're talking about as a group. Growth can occur, but we need the right circumstances and the right environment. And schools are a critical space for that to happen. And the MTSS is one way to make that happen. And I apologize for not being able to show everything. But if you're interested in hearing more of that, just send me an email and I'll try my best to explain it over email. Okay, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Liang. And I am amazed at the simplicity with all of you. All of you said such profound things, that how the mental health is spiraling down, right from the focus of the leadership team or the school leadership team into the teacher's well-being, spiraling down into the children's well-being, to the lesser behavioral problems and learning outcomes. Thank you so much. We have time for some questions, Ritika.
Yes, Samir, we do. And we have one question in the question answer panel and a few in the chat box to the panelists.
I think, Dr. Nitya, I'll address it to you because you've explained it very simply. Since everyone across the globe is speaking and concerned about the well-being of students, of course, they're an integral part of the system, but what about teachers? I think you've kind of answered that question for me, but I'll appreciate if you can take some time to explain how can teachers, in the time when the expectations from them are very high, not just from the management, but from the parents on the students. I think all of them are going through a lot of stress. How can they take care of themselves? But sadly, no one is speaking up about teachers' well-being.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Often in these sorts of situations, the one image that stays with me is that of how when you enter an airline, the crew will explain how when there's a drop in cabin pressure, there will be a mask that will drop, and they will say, first put on your mask before you help another person, right? And that's the image that stays with me. So no matter what role we play, no matter what system we are part of, I think it's useful to remember and remind ourselves that it is important to take care of ourselves. And when we take care of ourselves, it has a ripple effect on all the members of the systems that we belong to. So when we remind ourselves that, and one of the things in school systems is where there could be a peer support network, there could be a group of teachers who have their own ways of rejuvenating, right? Whether it is 10 minutes of sharing their children's stories and laughing about it, or whether it is sharing their hobby stories, or whether it is about anything that inspired them. right? Particularly in times such as now, like Dr. Liang mentioned, where there is so much collective stress and trauma, it is so important to look towards inspiration, to look towards positivity, to look towards examples of resilience. And while, yes, it is hard when nobody else speaks up, but when one person starts speaking up, very often it sets off a movement. And that is what I would recommend, that when you start taking care of yourself and form these little groups where your wellness is primary, then you'll find that it starts having a ripple effect on it as well. And I'm completely aware that it is much easier said than done. Dr. Preeti Jacob and I belong to the same team, and we've often discussed how important it is for us as members of a treating team to take time for ourselves, to reflect, to pause, and we know how hard it is to put it into practice. But we also know that when it is done, the effects are so inspiring that we do want to keep going.
I'd like to come in. Dr. Kami?
Please go ahead, Dr. Preeti.
Yeah, something that Dr. Nitya said struck me. Sometimes we look at counseling as something that is a very individual sort of help that one provides students or whoever the clientele is. But it's so important to have supervision. And by supervision, I mean the ability for the counselor to have someone to speak to discuss to discuss in a confidential manner matters regarding the client in a way to be able to be supervised regarding the inputs that they give and in order to feel supported. Sometimes in my practice, I have spoken to a number of counselors, and they oftentimes talk about the lack of support, and that itself leads to such stress because without being able to consult someone, without being able to share their concerns or challenges or difficulties that has arisen in the counseling space, itself puts so much of pressure because there is that caregiving burden that comes in, and that itself can accumulate and lead to caregiver burnout. And so I think it's very, very important that along with the idea that Dr. Mr. gave about having a group of people who are together in the ways in which they interact with one another, that there is also like Dr. Lian spoke about, a tired way of, of supervision being provided to counselors because no matter at what level one is, that supervision is so important to the counselors in case.
I'd like to jump in also. This is a great question and something I think is so important because, as I was saying earlier, the research does suggest that, um, you know, natural disasters like this cause a lot of fatigue and burnout in teachers. It's because they're so stretched in different ways because they're being asked to do so many more things, not just prepare lessons and to grade assessments, but to also take care of the well-being of their kids, of their students, while also attending to their own well-being and their own family's well-being. It's an incredible stress load, right? So there's only so much, right? That's past optimal, right? Would you agree, Dr. Preeti? That's past optimal. And so one of the things that we know also from the research is that administrative support during these times is critical. Teachers who experience higher levels of administrative support are less likely to experience the fatigue and the burnout, right? And so the question of how do we support teachers, I think really starts with the administrator. So certainly there are individual things that teachers can do and should do. And I think the suggestions that the panelists made are really important. Things that I do myself, I make sure to take at least a 15-minute walk every single day. I tell my own students to do the same. No matter how busy we are, we need that time. But the administrative support I think is really important because that creates the conditions for teachers to feel like they can do that, right? It's one thing to say do it, but if they don't feel like they can, then they will not, right? So administrators communicating with their teachers, it's okay for you to not respond to emails at night. Don't. In fact, you'll be reprimanded if you do, right? Take a walk, journal, reflect. The leaders, the administrators themselves can model this by having that circle time that some of your panelists have talked about in their meetings with their staff as a way of connecting and communicating with one another and as a way of slowing things down. We're working so fast and so hard right now, and we need to slow ourselves down. And the administrator can model that. I think one of the challenging things, and this is where the larger system comes in, is what are the expectations for teachers? Because there are federal standards, right? In your country, I'm sure this is in mine. There are standards that students are expected to meet, and it's the responsibility of the teacher. And we haven't heard enough from our leaders, at least in our country, of what those new expectations are given the context. We're kind of moving along business as usual, and this is not business as usual. So the system itself is very large and hard to change, but that's where we as school counselors can make an impact. We can communicate over and over again to our administrators. It's a two-way street, the communication. We can communicate upward. These are the issues, these are the problems. And we also need to communicate to our parents the realistic expectations and how challenging it all is. Normalizing it, giving them a sense that they're not alone, I think helps to contain some of the stress that people are experiencing.
Great. There is another question, which is what I talked about: lack of social interaction make things difficult in this pandemic. Any solution, any alternative? Recently, our school enrolled us for a course at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Dr. Liang, I was so surprised that universally, whichever country the participants were, we had one common challenge: the social presence. How do we address that? So maybe I'll take this question to you, and then probably to Dr. Nitya and Dr. Preeti to give their inputs in the context. Dr. Liang, you're muted, probably.
Thank you. So for me, it's a lot easier because I only teach doctoral students at this point. And so my classes are very small. And so actually later on today, for the first time this semester, we're going to be meeting at my house outdoors around a fire that I'm going to build so that we could be connecting with one another. And they were so happy to be able to do that. But I'm very fortunate and privileged to have a small class. I do think that it's a critical question, and we need to figure out how to do things safely together in person. And we also need to figure out how to do things remotely. Our young people may have some ideas, and I'm not sure that we've done a good enough job asking them how they already connect with one another online. I know some of my kids, my own sons, connect with their friends via gaming. I don't like gaming. I don't really like for my kids to be online much. I'm a typical Asian parent. You do your work, and then you get a little screen time later on, right? But I also recognize that there's value in them connecting with their friends via the gaming. They're talking, they're laughing, and it's not the way I want them to connect, but it's the best that we can do right now. But we can also supplement that with some safe outdoor types of events with kids, socially distant, and it also depends on the age group of the child. But I do think with adolescents and older, it's more than possible to get people together in socially distant type of ways if your government allows it, right? I do think that that's really critical and really important. I think the morning check-ins with kids are super important within the context of school. Some of the ideas that people have put on the chat are like things that I've recommended to my own schools that I work with.
Wait, Dr. Nitya, would you have a recommendation there? Are you muted, Dr. Nitya? You may have to unmute yourself.
Right. Thank you. I'm just so struck about how very often we tend to lean back on what we are used to, and we pine for those things that we enjoyed, and we want to recreate those. But like Dr. Liang mentioned, if we open it up and look at the situation with fresh eyes, it may be possible to identify newer ways of having this experience, right? Um, I'm sure many of you are aware of how in different countries and communities, at a set time, everybody would come out of their homes onto their balconies and sing for about half an hour, right? They're not getting in close proximity, but it is such a fresh collective energy. And in one of the other webcasts that I was part of, I heard how somewhere in Canada, in a locality, sometime kids just started howling like wolves at a particular time in the night. And so everybody started doing that for a while. Right? So just like a pack of wolves, everybody howling together. I'm not saying we howl like wolves in India, but I'm just saying maybe there's a way that we look at this whole situation with fresh eyes and see what might be possible. What could allow us to stay connected? And so sometimes even theater or music through remote modes offer such rejuvenating options for social connection, not as fatiguing as talking or texting. So those are options also that could be considered. But really to help ourselves accept that this is a new situation, and to say that, okay, what could we do in this new situation, and then to see what opens up for us. I think that might help us identify better options.
Thank you. Dr. Preeti?
Yeah. My take on it is that, especially in times like this, there's a tendency to paint a rosy picture of the past. And in my mind, things are terrible right now, but they weren't really great before. I mean, all too often we heard stories of children locked up in their rooms and on their various devices. So it's not that this is new. It is that this is an extension of what was already there. So in my mind, this pandemic offers, in a way, a unique opportunity to reset and to really look at what was going wrong, and in a way reset and look at things that we took for granted even. Um, uh, when when um, when things like this happen, it allows us to change and allows us to change for the better. Uh, we heard so many stories during the lockdown of people pulling out old board games, parents and children connecting in so many ways, going back to having family dinners together, going back to playing carom and playing, various things at home, which was simply not possible for a long period of time. And so I think this is a unique opportunity even to reset and to relook at the ways in which our lives have become, like what Dr. Liang spoke about, those little silos, and for ways in which we can come out of this and um, uh, come out of this in a manner where we don't go back to the things that we were doing badly, but come out of this with a sense of um, not just what not to come out of the trauma of what we have lost, but we look at the ways in which we can improve and move forward without repeating the mistakes of the past. So I think that this is a unique opportunity as well. I also think that homes can become closer, parental cohesion, the general sense of cohesion at home can improve. So it's a unique opportunity.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
I just so appreciate. I want to just add that part of the MTSS that I was talking about earlier, they didn't get into a whole lot of depth, is identifying the kids who might actually need more direct contact. So not everyone does. The assumption, right, with the question is that everyone needs it. But some of us, as Dr. Preeti was saying, we're reconnecting with our families and doing things that we didn't do before that we're really loving. They may not need that contact, but there's some kids who are really going to need it. And so part of the MTSS system is teachers and administrators and school counselors getting together to identify the kids who actually need that type of tier 2 service, right? The small group interactions. And then you organize that. And then there are some kids who are going to need more than that, and they might need in-home visits or some type of visit from a mental health professional to help them to cope with and learn how to cope with the types of conditions that they're experiencing now.
Great. I think these are very interesting points. And as you say, normal is very subjective concept, and hence everyone's normal looks different and is uniquely individual to every human being. So there are some universal impressions that we can continue to embrace in our lives as the world begins to resume back to normal. These things include self-care, taking up from all of what you said, self-care, quality time with your loved ones, taking care of the environment, embracing a sense of community, enhancing gratitude, being considerate of others, cultivating mindfulness. And although this pandemic has caused a lot of anxiety, stress, but I think we can look at something which is positive coming out of this, and that is embracing a new perspective to create a new normal. We all can start to make some positive changes in ourselves and the world around. So over to you, Ritika. I think with that we close. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you to all the panelists. It's been so far, I thank you, Sanam, for this opportunity and Ritika for this opportunity. I would say I've done more than, I think, 20 webinars. This has been the so far most rewarding. My other friends are going to be angry with me. But this was a really, really one of the most rewarding experiences I had. So thank you to each one of you.
Thank you. On that note, Samir, I will just, say a couple of lines from the word rewarding. In 2020, early, before the pandemic and before the new normal came into being, we started this journey thinking about what we want to do in the space of school counselors and well-being of students and the wider group. And at that point, we had a few ideas. At the end of these 60 minutes, I think I've learned a lot from all four of you, from the three panelists and from you, Samir, to just have an understanding, sit back, reflect, and perceive things in a different way. A lot of the questions that we have received, we've tried to cover. There have been a few more questions which we will try and respond to via email. And any other questions any one of you have which come up later on reflection, please do write into us at the registration ID, and we will make sure we share them with the panelists. And needless to say, they have been absolutely a delight today. I thank you on behalf of Sanamas for not only for your time, but also having the trust. And this is our first webinar for the Counselors Excellence Series. So we look forward to working alongside all of you. And to all the attendees for patiently listening and for your questions. I know it's late evening in India and you have a long day ahead, Dr. Liang, so I will not take more time. But thank you, Dr. Liang, Dr. Purnima, Dr. Jacob, and Samir for this wonderful, you've said opportunity, but I would say, I use the same word for this opportunity for me to be witnessing and, standing with you all on this panel. Have a wonderful day and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting both Satya and me. And it's been a wonderful experience. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Liang.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
This
you.
has been
Thank you.
wonderful.